In the beautiful and peaceful village of Tandari, there lived a young girl named Asale. She was known far and wide for her incredible speed and agility. Whenever she ran, it was as if the wind carried her feet, making her the fastest girl in the village. Her father, Chief Damu, loved her dearly and was proud of her talents. However, after the tragic death of Asale's mother, everything in her life began to change. Chief Damu remarried a woman named Nalela, hoping to bring happiness back into his home. But Nalela was not the kind and loving wife he had expected. Deep in her heart, she carried a burning hatred for Asale. She did not like how much Chief Damu cared for his daughter, and she wanted all his attention to be on her and her own daughter, Kamura. Unlike Asale, Kamura was lazy, spoiled, and filled with jealousy. She could not stand the way the villagers admired Asale's strength and skill. One day, a royal messenger arrived in Tandari with exciting news. The king had announced a grand competition to find the fastest and strongest girl in the land. The winner would be given a great honor. She would join the royal court as a personal runner and messenger for the kingdom. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The entire village knew that Asale was the most likely to win. She was the best runner in Tandari, and no one could match her speed. But this news filled Nalela with rage. She could not allow Asale to win such an honor. If Asale joined the king's court, she would become even more respected, and her father would be prouder of her than ever. Nalela refused to let that happen. She decided that no matter what, she would stop Asale from competing. And so, she began to plan something terrible, something that would take away Asale's ability to run forever. From the moment the royal competition was announced, Nalela's heart burned with hatred. She could not let Asale win. She wanted her own daughter, Kamura, to take the honor, even though everyone knew Kamura was neither fast nor strong. But Nalela did not care about fairness. She only cared about destroying Asale's chances. Nalela began treating Asale worse than ever before. She forced her to do endless chores from dawn till night, making sure she had no time or energy left to practice running. While Kamura lay on soft mats and ate the finest meals, Asale was made to sweep the compound, carry heavy firewood, fetch water from the farthest stream, and scrub the floors until her hands ached. And even after all that, Nalela would find another task, making sure Asale never had a moment to rest. At mealtimes, Nalela would serve Kamura large bowls of rich, delicious food, roasted meat, warm maize porridge, and fresh fruit. But when it was Asale's turn, Nalela would hand her the smallest portion, sometimes nothing more than a dry piece of bread or a few spoonfuls of cold leftovers. "You do not need much food," Nalela would say, with a cruel smile. "You are just a little girl with nowhere to go." Hunger gnawed at Asale's stomach every day, but she never complained. She knew that if she showed weakness, Nalela would only treat her worse. At night, while Kamura slept in a warm bed covered with thick blankets, Asale was forced to sleep outside on the hard ground. The cold air bit at her skin, and she shivered under the night sky, her body aching from exhaustion. Some nights, she cried silently, wondering why her father did not see what was happening. But Chief Damu remained blind to Nalela's cruelty. Nalela was clever. She always pretended to be a kind and caring stepmother when he was around. If Asale ever looked weak or tired, Nalela would sigh and say, "She is lazy, my husband. She refuses to help with the chores. That is why she looks so worn out." And Chief Damu, trusting his wife, believed her lies. Kamura, on the other hand, enjoyed every moment of Asale's suffering. She would laugh as Asale struggled to carry heavy loads, teasing her with cruel words. "What is the point of running when you are nothing but a servant?" she mocked. "You should just accept your place." Whenever Asale tried to find a quiet moment to stretch or move her legs, Kamura would call Nalela, who would quickly find another task to keep her occupied. But no matter how much she suffered, Asale did not give up. Deep in her heart, she still believed in her dream. Whenever she had a moment alone, she would practice in secret. Late at night, when everyone was asleep, she would stretch her legs and strengthen her muscles. Early in the morning, before the sun had risen, she would run in the hidden paths behind the village, feeling the wind against her face. She refused to let Nalela and Kamura break her spirit. She knew she was meant for something greater, and no amount of cruelty could take that away from her. The night was darker than usual, and a cold wind swept through the village of Tandari. Asale had just finished another exhausting day of endless chores. Her body ached, but she still clung to her dream. She knew the royal race was only days away, and despite all that Nalela had done to weaken her, she believed she could still win. As she sat outside, resting her tired legs, Nalela appeared at the doorway. Her face was calm, almost gentle, which was unusual. "Asale," she called softly. "Your father is looking for you. He sent a messenger. He wants to see you right away. He is waiting by the old baobab tree." Asale's heart lifted at the mention of her father. She missed him terribly, but lately he had been distant. If he had sent for her, it must be important. She quickly rose to her feet, pushing aside her exhaustion. "I will go to him," she said eagerly, not noticing the way Nalela's lips curled into a wicked smile. Without hesitation, Asale followed the narrow path leading out of the village. The baobab tree stood at the edge of the forest, its thick branches stretching toward the sky like arms frozen in the dark. But as she approached, she felt something was wrong. The air was too still. There were no voices, no sign of her father. Before she could turn back, a shadow moved behind her. Then, pain, sharp, blinding pain, shot through her body as something heavy struck her leg. She screamed and collapsed, clutching her knee. Her vision blurred, and through the darkness, she saw them. Kimura stood nearby, her eyes gleaming with cruel delight. Beside her were two men, Nalela's brothers, strong and merciless. "Asale, the great runner," Kimura sneered. "Let's see how fast you are now." One of the men lifted a heavy stone and brought it down on Asale's other leg. A sickening crack filled the night, followed by another scream of pain. Asale's body shook, her breath coming in short gasps. She could feel the bones in her legs shatter, the unbearable pain spreading through her like fire. She tried to crawl, to move, but Kimura knelt beside her and whispered, "You will never run again." Then, with a final look of satisfaction, she and the men disappeared into the shadows, leaving Asale broken and bleeding on the cold earth. Hours passed. The pain was unbearable. She lay there, helpless, her breath shallow. The wind howled around her, and the sounds of the night creatures filled her ears. She tried to call for help, but her voice was weak. No one would hear her. Back in the village, Nalela had already spread her lies. With fake tears in her eyes, she told the villagers that Asale had been attacked by wild animals on her way to meet her father. "She wanted to practice running in the dark," she sobbed. "We told her it was dangerous, but she didn't listen." By the time the villagers found Asale the next morning, she was barely conscious. Her once powerful legs lay limp and useless. The girl who had once outrun the wind was now unable to move at all. And worst of all, she knew the truth. This was no accident. It was a betrayal. A cruel, merciless betrayal. Asale drifted in and out of consciousness, her body trapped in a world of pain. The cold earth beneath her felt like ice against her skin, and the sharp throbbing in her legs was unbearable. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but every breath felt like fire in her chest. The night stretched endlessly, wrapping her in darkness and silence. She tried to move, but nothing happened. Her legs, once so strong, now felt like dead weight. Panic rose in her throat. She clenched her fists, digging her nails into her palms to stay awake. She couldn't be out here alone. Someone had to find her. Someone had to help her. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. The village was beginning to stir when a group of farmers, on their way to the fields, spotted something unusual near the edge of the forest. One of them gasped, "It's a girl!" Rushing forward, they found Asale lying motionless, her body covered in dirt and dried blood. Her clothes were torn, and her legs were twisted unnaturally. One of the farmers knelt beside her, shaking her gently. "Asale, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered open, and a weak groan escaped her lips. The villagers exchanged worried glances. "We need to get her back to the village," another man said urgently. Carefully, they lifted her, but even the smallest movement made her cry out in pain. By the time they reached Tandari, a small crowd had gathered, whispering in hushed voices. Nalela and Kimura stood at the front, their faces masks of concern. The moment Nalela saw Asale, she let out a dramatic wail and rushed forward. "Oh, my poor child," she cried, kneeling beside her. "What happened to you?" Asale opened her mouth to speak, to tell everyone the truth, but before she could, Nalela turned to the villagers with tears streaming down her face. "She must have been attacked by wild animals. I warned her not to go out at night, but she never listens." The villagers murmured in agreement. It made sense. After all, the forest was dangerous at night. Who would suspect a mother of harming her own stepdaughter? Nalela pressed a trembling hand to her chest and continued. I begged her to stay home, but she was always so stubborn. Oh, my heart is breaking. Chief Damu pushed through the crowd, his face pale with worry. His eyes filled with sorrow when he saw Asale's broken form. My child, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Who did this to you? Asale tried to speak, but the pain and exhaustion were too much. Her vision blurred as she saw Nalela wrap a comforting arm around her father, whispering words of false grief. Damu shook his head, his body sagging with helplessness. He believed Nalela's lies. Asale's heart sank. No one would believe her. No one would punish Nalela, Kamora, or the men who had done this to her. She was trapped in her pain, trapped in a body that no longer worked. Her dreams of running, of feeling the wind in her hair and the earth beneath her feet, were gone. She was broken, and worse, she was alone. Days passed, but Asale's pain never lessened. She could no longer walk, no longer train, no longer be the girl she once was. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like a shadow of herself. Whenever she tried to sit up, the sharp agony in her legs reminded her of the life that had been stolen from her. Nalela played the role of the grieving stepmother well. She walked around the village, sighing deeply, telling anyone who would listen how much she loved Asale, how heartbroken she was to see her like this. But in private, her kindness turned to cruelty. She is just a burden now, she told Chief Damu one night. She can do nothing for herself. She will never run again. What kind of life is this? Chief Damu lowered his head. He had always loved Asale, but seeing her like this filled him with deep sorrow. He was a man of the village, a man who believed that only the strong survived. A child who could no longer contribute, who could no longer bring honor to the family, was a child who had no future. Nalela placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her voice soft and full of false sympathy. She is suffering, my husband. Keeping her here is cruel. Let her go. At first, he refused. He wanted to believe that Asale could heal, but each time he saw her struggling to sit up, to move, to live a normal life, doubt crept into his heart. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he agreed. The next morning, 2 men carried Asale out of the house on a wooden mat. She was too weak to fight, too broken to protest. The villagers watched in silence as they carried her past the huts, past the fields, past the place she had once trained every morning. Some whispered that it was unfair. Others said it was for the best. No one stopped them. They carried her far beyond the village, to the dry outskirts where the land was barren and the air was hot. There, they placed her under a lonely baobab tree and walked away without a word. For the first time in her life, Asale was truly alone. She lay there for hours, staring at the endless sky, feeling like a broken doll that had been tossed aside. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and thirst burned in her throat. But worse than the physical pain was the emptiness inside her. She had been abandoned by the people she loved, cast out like she was nothing. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she slowly turned her body. If she stayed here, she would die. She had to move. She had to find water, find shelter, find something. With all the strength she had left, she dragged herself forward, inch by inch. The dry ground scraped against her skin, and every movement sent waves of pain through her body. But she did not stop. She did not know where she was going. She did not know if she would survive, but she refused to give up. Somewhere in the distance, the thick shadows of a dense forest loomed ahead. With one final push, Asale crawled toward it and collapsed, her body too weak to go on. And then, everything went black. Asale drifted between darkness and light, her body too weak to fight, her mind floating between dreams and pain. She felt herself being lifted, soft hands cradling her broken form. A gentle voice whispered words she did not understand, but they carried warmth, like the embrace of a mother she had lost long ago. Then everything faded again. When she woke, she was lying on a soft bed of woven grass, inside a small hut that smelled of herbs and burning incense. The walls were decorated with dried leaves, animal bones, and strange symbols carved into wood. A fire flickered in the corner, casting long shadows across the room. "You are awake," a voice said. Asale turned her head and saw an old woman sitting beside her. Her hair was silver, her skin dark and wrinkled like the bark of an ancient tree. But her eyes were sharp, bright, filled with a power Asale could not understand. Who are you?" Asale croaked, her throat dry. "I am Mama Rohana," the woman said. "And you, child, were not meant to die in that forest." Tears welled in Asale's eyes as she remembered everything. The betrayal, the pain, the feeling of being thrown away like she was nothing. "I cannot run anymore," she whispered. "My legs, they are useless." Mama Rohana leaned forward, her eyes piercing into Asale's soul. "Running is not the only way to move," she said. "Speed is not only in the legs. Power is not only in the body. You have lost one gift, but there is another waiting for you." At first, Asale did not understand, but Mama Rohana was patient. She healed Asale's wounds with strange herbs, fed her with nourishing broths, and made her drink bitter potions that burned her throat, but filled her body with warmth. Slowly, Asale regained her strength, though her legs would never be the same. Then, the true training began. Mama Rohana did not pity her. She did not treat her like a broken girl. She made Asale lift herself with only her arms, forced her to balance on ropes tied between trees, taught her to swing from branches like a bird in flight. She showed her how to listen to the wind, how to feel its direction, how to move with it instead of against it. At first, Asale struggled. She fell. She failed. She wanted to give up. But each time, Mama Rohana would only watch and say, "Again." And so Asale tried again, and again, and again. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Asale's body changed. Her arms became strong, her movements quick and precise. She learned how to launch herself into the air, how to use her hands and upper body to travel faster than even the fastest runner. She moved like the wind, free, untouchable, unstoppable. One evening, as the sun set over the trees, Mama Rohana smiled at her. "You were never meant to run, child," she said. "You were meant to fly." For the first time in a long time, Asale smiled back. The years passed like the wind, swift and uncatchable. Asale was no longer the weak, broken girl who had been left to die in the forest. Under Mama Rohana's guidance, she had become something greater, something stronger. People whispered of her in nearby villages, calling her the woman of the sky. They spoke of a girl who could move faster than any runner, a warrior who could swing from trees like a spirit of the wind, untouchable and free. Asale had mastered combat in a way no one had ever seen before. She could climb walls using only her hands, leap from high branches, and use ropes to propel herself through the air. Her strength no longer came from her legs, but from her spirit, from the fire that burned inside her. She had found a new kind of speed, one that defied limits. One day, as she sat outside Mama Rohana's hut, watching the sun dip behind the trees, a group of travelers arrived. They carried news from Tandari. The village was suffering. A terrible drought had left the land dry, and people were starving. But worse than that, Chief Damu, Asale's father, was gravely ill. The people feared he would not last long. Asale's heart clenched at the news. She had long buried the pain of her past, telling herself that Tandari was no longer her home. But hearing about her father's suffering stirred something deep inside her. Despite everything, she still loved him. "There is more," one of the travelers said hesitantly. "The king is searching for a wise and powerful leader to help guide the kingdom. Someone strong, someone unlike any before." Mama Rohana looked at Asale, her old eyes knowing. "It is time," she said simply. Asale closed her eyes, feeling the wind rush past her face. She had spent years training, learning, growing into someone new. She was no longer a helpless girl. She was a warrior, a legend, a force of nature. She opened her eyes. "I must go back." With Mama Rohana's blessing, Asale prepared for the journey. She wrapped her hands in cloth, tightened the straps of her ropes, and filled a small pouch with herbs and potions from the healer. She was not returning as the girl they had broken. She was returning as the woman they could never destroy. Asale took one last look at the place that had given her a second life. Then, with one swift motion, she grabbed onto a low-hanging branch, swung herself upward, and disappeared into the trees. She did not walk back to Tandari. She flew. The grand selection trials were being held in the heart of Tandari, where the strongest and wisest would be chosen to serve in the king's court. The village was alive with excitement, and among the crowd, a hooded figure stood silently, watching. No one paid attention to her, just another traveler, another competitor. But beneath the heavy warrior's cloak was Asale, returning to the village that had once cast her away. Her heart pounded as she spotted Kimura standing proudly among the contestants. Kimura was dressed in fine silks, her face full of confidence. She had been chosen to compete, but Asale could see the truth. Kimura was weak. She had never worked hard for anything in her life, and now, without Asale to overshadow her, she had become even lazier. The trials began. The first challenge was a race across the open fields, but Kimura struggled, barely keeping up. Asale smirked beneath her hood. The second challenge was a test of strategy, where competitors had to solve a puzzle to prove their intelligence. Kimura fumbled, looking to others for answers. Then came the final trial, the test of wisdom and endurance. The king's advisor stood before the remaining contestants and spoke. A true leader is not just strong in body, but in mind and heart. Only those who understand pain, struggle, and resilience can truly guide others. A murmur spread through the crowd. The contestants whispered among themselves, unsure of how to prove such a thing. That was when Asale stepped forward. Slowly, she reached for her hood and pulled it back. Gasps filled the air. Whispers turned to shouts. "It cannot be!" Asale! But she was gone. Kimura's face drained of color. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Nalela, standing in the crowd, clutched her chest as if she had seen a ghost. Asale stood tall, her piercing gaze sweeping over the village that had forgotten her. "I was cast away like a broken doll," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I was left to die because I could no longer run, but destiny had other plans for me." She threw off her cloak, revealing the lean, powerful warrior she had become. "You thought breaking my legs would end me," she said, looking straight at Kimura and Nalela. "But I did not need legs to rise again. I have learned to fly." Silence fell. Even the king's advisors seemed at a loss for words. Then, from the highest seat, the king himself stood, his eyes filled with curiosity and admiration. "A warrior does not come from strength alone, but from the fire within," he declared. "This woman has endured more than any test we could create. She is the true leader we seek." A wave of murmurs and cheers spread through the crowd. Asale had returned, not as a broken girl, but as a legend. The village of Tandari stood frozen in silence. The whispers had died down, replaced by a thick tension that hung in the air. All eyes were on Asale, the girl who had once been cast away, now standing tall before them. The truth could no longer be hidden. Asale turned slowly, her gaze locking onto Nalela and Kimura, who stood at the edge of the crowd. Kimura was shaking, her hands clenched into fists, while Nalela's face had gone pale. The once proud woman, who had worn fine robes and walked with arrogance, now looked small and weak. "You told the village I was attacked by wild animals," Asale said, her voice steady but sharp as a blade. "You cried fake tears and made my father believe you cared. But all this time, it was you. You and your brothers broke my legs so I could never run again." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Villagers turned to each other, eyes wide with shock. Chief Damu, standing near the king's court, stumbled back, as if the ground beneath him had crumbled. "No, it cannot be," he whispered, his face filled with confusion and pain. Nalela dropped to her knees, grabbing the hem of Chief Damu's robes. "My husband, do not listen to her," she cried. "She is lying. She wants revenge." Asale's eyes burned with fury. "You want to talk about revenge, Nalela? What about what you did to me? You broke me and threw me away like I was nothing. You forced me to crawl through the dirt, abandoned, left to die." Her voice grew louder, filled with the pain of years of suffering. "But I survived, and now, the truth will not be buried." Kimura let out a broken sob, stepping back as if trying to disappear. I was just following Mother's orders," she stammered. "I never wanted to." "Enough!" Chief Damu's voice thundered across the village square. His whole body trembled, his face twisted in grief and rage. He turned to Nalela, his eyes dark with betrayal. "You deceived me. You made me send away my own daughter. You made me believe she was beyond saving. And all this time, you were the monster in my home." Nalela's lips trembled. "Please, my husband, I did it for Kimura, for our future." "There is no future for those who destroy others." The king's voice rang out from his seat. He stood, his royal robes flowing in the breeze. "Strength is not found in the legs, nor in power or wealth. It is found in the heart. And today, it is clear. Asale has more strength than any of us." The village erupted in cheers. The people of Tandari had seen the truth, and they would not stand for such cruelty. Chief Damu looked down at Nalela and Kimura, his heart heavy. "You are banished from this village. Both of you. Never return." Nalela let out a wail, but no one stepped forward to help her. Kimura fell to her knees, sobbing, but it was too late. Justice had struck like lightning, and there was no escaping its wrath. The sun was setting over Tandari as Nalela and Kimura were cast out of the village. The same people who once feared and respected them now turned their backs. No one offered them food. No one spoke in their defense. With nothing but the clothes on their backs, they walked away, their feet dragging through the dust of the path that led far beyond the village. Days passed, and hunger clawed at their stomachs. Nalela, who once lived in comfort, now begged strangers for a piece of bread. Kamura, who had once mocked Asale for being covered in dirt, now had dust clinging to her face as she sat by the roadside, hoping someone would take pity on her. But the world was not kind to those who had shown no kindness. Their cries for help were ignored. Their past sins had followed them, and there was no escape from the justice of fate. Back in Tandari, a new chapter was being written. Asale, the girl who had once been broken and abandoned, had become something greater than anyone had imagined. The king himself had honored her, naming her the greatest warrior in the land. She was no longer just the fastest runner. She had become a legend, known as the Woman of the Sky. Though she could no longer run on her own 2 feet, she had mastered a new kind of movement. She soared through the air like the wind, her strength unmatched, her wisdom respected by all. In the king's court, she was not just a warrior, she was a symbol of resilience, of a spirit that could not be broken. One evening, as the cool breeze swept through the royal palace, Asale stood at the highest point, looking out over the kingdom. The wind played with her hair, whispering stories of the past, but she no longer felt pain when she thought of it. She had been thrown away, but she had risen higher than anyone ever expected. She had lost her legs, but she had gained something even greater, wings that no one could ever cut. She closed her eyes and smiled, letting the wind embrace her. She was no longer the girl who had been betrayed. She was Asale, the girl who grew wings, the girl who defied fate, the girl who had proven that true strength comes not from what the body can do, but from what the heart refuses to give up.